What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the Points Per Podcast. Thank you for joining us as always. My name's Eric. That's my co-host, Will. And today we are bringing to you 6 lessons learned from the 2025 fantasy football season. We're getting reflective. We're trying to learn things. We're trying to help you guys out heading into 2026. And so that's what we hope to do today. But before we get into it, I got to shout you out, man. Big happy birthday to my co-host, Will. I hope you have a great day. And I think this is a perfect video for you to bestow your newfound wisdom upon us.
Absolutely, man. Another year closer to 30, so, looking good there. But yeah, honestly, just looking forward to another great year. Thank you guys for the great year that we had this past year. And an excellent birthday gift would be for you guys to hit that subscribe button, hit that like button. It's absolutely free and gets our stuff out there. And comment down below. Let's say some happy birthdays down below. You know what I'm saying?
I don't know why my screen turned into fireworks there, but it was perfectly timed. I like it.
Crazy. Yeah, what the hell?
But with that, let's get into this thing. Waste no more time. Will, I'm going to throw to you. It's your birthday. What's your first lessons learned from 2025?
My first nugget of wisdom for 2025 is that late round quarterbacks have kind of been the wave for the last few years, and they've continued to be the wave this year because while having guys like Josh Allen, the advantage of that hasn't completely disappeared at all. It's still there because he is at the pinnacle of fantasy football, and he's been there for years. But that gap is closing. This past year, Josh Allen finishes the QB1 with 21.4 points per game, but right on his heels, Mr. Drake May with 20.7 and Matt Stafford with 20.6. So that gap really closed down going into this year. And their preseason rankings going into it, Drake May was the QB 13 and Matt Stafford was going undrafted as the QB 21. So when you're looking at stuff like that, it doesn't really make sense to go early QB too much if you're going for that positional advantage because it just really isn't quite as there. Now, other deep values like Jared Goff, Justin Herbert, and Caleb Williams, they were also top 12 this year. We even saw Daniel Jones before he got injured putting up QB8 numbers this year. And he was a guy, obviously, people weren't looking at Daniel Jones as a guy to draft going into this season at all. Jackson Dart was even a top 10 fantasy option once he started for the Giants and he got the actual start. But I do want to say, take this with a grain of salt because some big names did miss out on some time this year. Guys like Jaden Daniels missed a lot of time. Lamar Jackson missed a lot of time. Obviously, Patrick Mahomes went down with the ACL tear. I just want to point out that the drop-off that we at least once saw from the top to the guys beneath him, it's at least gotten a little bit slimmer as time has gone along. But like I said, take it with a grain of salt because the top guys, we missed a lot of them this year.
Yeah, absolutely. This was, we put together our individual lists and then came together and kind of came to a consensus. This is one that we both had on here as well. You mentioned some of the guys that were finished right behind Josh Allen, but we had Drake May, Matt Stafford, Trevor Lawrence, Caleb Williams, and Dak Prescott were all immediately behind Josh Allen. And if we're looking at it through a one quarterback lens, according to Fantasy Pros, they had a combined ADP of the 11th round versus the investment you would have had to put into Josh Allen being a second round pick, basically, that 2-3 turn. And so just looking at it from that perspective, like if we're talking second versus 11th round, would you rather have this past year Jonathan Taylor and Drake May or what? Josh Allen and like Austin Eckler or like JSN and Dak or Allen and Jordan Mason? Like it's a pretty easy decision when you look at it that way, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And you made a great point to talk about how, we're not necessarily completely throwing the elite quarterback strategy out the window. We saw a ton of these guys get hurt, whether it be Lamar, Daniels, Burrow, Mahomes. Jalen Hurts was really the only kind of elite quarterback tier option aside from Josh Allen that finished anywhere close to his draft position. I believe he was drafted as the QB4 and finished as the QB8. But even if you look at points per game for the rest of the elite quarterbacks that I just mentioned, because obviously in total points, they're going to be way behind considering their injuries, they were still only QB 15 through 17, like all back to back to back in terms of points per game. So even when they were in your lineups, they weren't producing that highly. And so I think that really drives this point home even more. And then the last thing that I kind of wanted to touch on was that quarterback scoring, I feel like, has been down over the past 2 years just in general. This kind of defensive meta switch where they're limiting the explosives, forcing quarterbacks to dink and dunk and really get their big plays as intermediates versus big shots over the top. It's leading to more production in the running game, which I think we'll probably get to in our lessons learned a little bit later. But also potentially lowering that ceiling for the elite quarterbacks and making the difference not as big as it once was.
Yeah, absolutely. The field isn't nearly as big as it used to be. Like those numbers have come down a lot in past years. So I think it's going to close even more as time goes along.
Absolutely. So that will be lesson learned number one. We'll move into our second one here. For me, that's going to be don't let individual player biases hold you back from investing in good offenses. I felt like I penalized myself a lot with this one this year. We on this channel, I think we're really buying into a lot of these offenses, like the Jaguars and Cowboys. For me specifically, I was so hyped up about them. The Bears were another one with these new play callers coming into different situations, good rosters. Of course, you want to invest in them. They're fantasy-friendly environments. But there were notably three very valuable running backs that we as a channel and me specifically didn't heavily advocate for, and that I personally ended up with nearly zero exposure to, and that's Travis Etienne, Javonte Williams, and DeAndre Swift. And that was simply because of the biases that I held against them and how they've performed in past seasons. And I think, we'll have more to say on this as we go throughout the lesson. Some of these kind of intertwine with one another. But I should have just allowed myself to buy into these offenses as a whole. I kind of nitpicked and went specific with these individual players from these offenses when I think it would have been a good idea to just expose myself to the entire thing.
No, I 100% agree. I think that as fantasy football players, we get so, tied into the news and just so tied into the hype that sometimes it's hard to see past those narratives. And sometimes those narratives can just become the group thought after a while. So, like when we're talking about guys like Javonte Williams, he's a guy who it made perfect sense for him to do what he did this year, but just based off of the last couple of years and how people have talked about Javonte Williams, nobody really wanted a piece of him. But he's a guy who came off of one of the more brutal knee injuries we've seen, and he struggled behind what was actually a pretty good Broncos offensive line. So I
Yeah.
don't really fault people for thinking that he was bad. But when you're coming off an injury like that, and then you move over to an elite offense and they're willing to pay him to bring him to that team, obviously they saw something that they, like to see. And obviously this year we got to see that on the field. Whether we got lucky or not that Miles Sanders ended up on IR and that cleared things up for Javonte Williams more, obviously we can't get in the time machine and go back and see. We got what we got. But Javonte Williams is one of those guys that, based on the situation and how good we thought this Dallas offense was going to be, we definitely should have took more looks at him. And and just to roll off of that, well, go ahead if you want to still talk about the running backs.
No, I just for Javonte specifically, like I think the kind of overarching narrative was that he was washed.
Yeah.
Which, you know, I wouldn't fault anybody. That's kind of how I felt coming into the season. But he was still young. Like when he was drafted, I think he was only 20 years old. And what is he, like 25 or 26 at this point? He's not like over the running back age cliff necessarily. It's not like we're talking about Nick Chubb at this point coming off of a major knee injury. He's had 2 years to recover. I just think, me personally, and I hope that you guys can take something from this as well, is that we need to kind of expand the range of outcomes that we're thinking about. Even if Javonte Williams 75% of the time would have looked washed and wouldn't have produced the way that he did this year, we need to account for the fact that he's in a great Cowboys offense that's going to score a ton of points, that's going to be high paced, run a lot of plays. Even if it's not a super high chance, maybe he could have a season like this and at least be a little bit exposed to him.
Absolutely. And this isn't without leaving out guys like Kyle Pitts, because he was one of the main guys I wanted to talk about in this little segment right here. And just this is why I say like these narratives kind of get in the way of people picking, good players for good reasons. Because looking back on things is actually really funny, because we always said before Kyle Pitts that it always took a while for young tight ends to break out. But then Kyle Pitts, the young tight end, breaks out. And all of a sudden we're like, oh man, these young tight ends, they can break out. And that's continued to be a trend going forward. But the person that started that was Kyle Pitts. And then he tears his ACL. And all of a sudden, we're ready to just throw away the 25-year-old 6'6" former greatest tight end prospect of all time.
Yeah.
And going into this season, he finishes as the tight end 2 overall and the tight end, I think, 5 in points per game. But it's like, it's one of those situations where it's like, yeah, you got to kind of be patient. This is a guy who he literally tore his ACL in year 2. Year 3, we already know you're going to struggle the first year off an ACL tear. And then year 4, he's got Arthur Smith, who was almost worse than an ACL tear. It's just one of those things where you got to kind of give these guys the grace to actually develop a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's completely fair. and give it that proper context. One, what you already gave it, but even still, like I think there was an MCL sprain in there that was kind of
Yeah,
underreported, which if we didn't know about it, there's only so much you can do. But after the fact, giving him the grace, knowing that he was dealing with that MCL sprain, and kind of allowing that to let us buy back in especially when the price is right, like it was this year, because he was so cheap. And really, I think that that's a good lesson to be learned as well, even though it's not necessarily one that I had written down. That applies to all of these guys: the Travis Etienne's, Javonte Williams, DeAndre Swift, Kyle Pitts. Like these are all guys that had tremendous profiles and were exciting at one point, haven't aged out. Like it's not like they're too old. It's just that they've disappointed us for however many years in a row. Um, be willing to buy back into them when their price is dramatically depressed, like it was this year, especially if they're in good situations, which for the most part they all were.
absolutely. And that's going to bring us to our next one because it's sort of on the other side, or it's actually pretty similar to this still. Because it's don't buy into young guys so much that you miss out on the vets that have potential to be targeted slash used a lot. Because there were a lot of guys, namely like Chris Olave and Michael Pittman, who Chris Olave preseason was ranked as the wide receiver 38. Came off a couple of disappointing seasons. We know he has a lot of injuries. And we have Michael Pittman, who was preseason wide receiver 40. And both of them greatly performed their ADPs. I think Chris Olave finishes the wide receiver 6, and Michael Pittman finishes the wide receiver 18. And those are two guys who were high volume guys going into this season. And they were high volume guys in the past. They just kind of struggled a little bit, whether that was due to injury or whether that was due to situation. So be it. But still, those are two guys who have shown that they can perform at high levels that struggled in the past, and we decided to get off of them. Now, with that being said, we're also doing that, and then we're looking at these younger guys and expecting them to be, oh, they're going to take the reins immediately and hit. And I get where the fun is in that. Like Emeka Egbuka, Tet McMillan, I was fully in on Emeka Egbuka. You guys saw the videos on this channel. I was having an absolute blast.
Yeah.
But in making that pick, I did miss out on somebody who could have been the wide receiver 6, like a Chris Olave, whereas I think Emeka Egbuka finished around like wide receiver 20 on the end of the season. He was like the wide receiver 40 something in the playoffs. So
Yeah.
there was a steep drop off for Emeka Egbuka going there. So it's just that rookies just aren't a sure thing coming into the league. And they can range anywhere from someone who's a high volume player like a Tech McMillan to a Caleb Johnson where things don't work out at all and they don't end up on the field at all. So be careful where you're using your picks, because if you're a guy who drafted Caleb Johnson, you're probably wishing you drafted a Jalen Warren or even a Kenneth Gainwell, who came at a much bigger discount. Even when we were getting news out of camp that Caleb Johnson was struggling in camp, we got that news, and for some reason we were still valuing Caleb Johnson too early going in the drafts. And that same mistake like I made with Trevion Henderson going in the 4th instead of taking someone later like a Travis Etienne Jr., who actually was getting that good news coming out of camp. But because of past biases, I was out on him. I was like, he's an older guy. They got a new guy in there too, with Bayshaw Tootin. He's going to get factored out of the offense. They got Take Bisbee too. Yeah, that's just not how the season turned out. I think what we got to do is really trust who these players are, what they've shown us, and trust that these coaches, especially when it's a new situation and a guy like Liam Cohen is coming in and he's ringing the bell for a guy like that, I think it's something you really do need to listen to.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. I think you might be a little too hard on yourself on some of the specific examples you gave. I think buying into, like you mentioned, Travion Henderson, I don't think that's a bad idea necessarily. We saw how explosive he was when he did get the lion's share of the touches, or at least was finally given enough opportunity to show what he had. And so I don't think that that was necessarily a bad move, especially when you consider the alternative, when it's not really an alternative, being Travis Etienne, because you could take both, right? Like you
Fair.
could take one at the high end for the upside. If it busts, that's unfortunate, but you could take the swing on a guy much later, take a flyer on a guy like Travis Etienne. So I think the context there is what's key. Um, you don't want to overinvest in rookies without paying attention to the offseason buzz, without paying attention to the drumbeat from the coaching staff and things of that nature. And just, again, offensive environment. We've talked about that a ton throughout the season and so far in this video. Make sure you're buying into guys in good offensive situations. But yes, we do tend to get locked in on the young guys, on the new shiny toys that have the potential. And that's, typically a good way to hit on upside, but it's also a risky proposition when sometimes there's a much less risky option with the vets going later. So I completely agree with this take.
Absolutely. And what else are we rounding it out with?
Yeah, so that's going to transition us into my next lesson. Don't pay a premium for handcuff or kind of 1B running backs. So the guys that I have as examples for this are guys like David Montgomery, Jordan Mason, Zach Charbonnet. Coming into the season, these guys were getting drafted ahead of some of the guys we just talked about with Travis Etienne, Javonte Williams, DeAndre Swift, and even guys like J.K. Dobbins, Quinshon Judkins, or Cam Scatabo. All guys who, even with injury, like you would say, probably outperformed those first three guys I mentioned. And that's just the running backs. According to Fantasy Pros ADP, David Montgomery was getting drafted ahead of guys like George Pickens, Rashee Rice, and Chris Olave, who all had tremendous, very, very valuable fantasy seasons. Although David Montgomery, Jordan Mason, Zach Charbonnet did have some relevant weeks, we were never confident in putting them in our starting lineup unless their 1A or the starter in that offense was injured and out, right? And so that's kind of the point that I want to make here is take this context into account. Demont, Mason, Charbonnet could be valuable. They're talented in their own right, but just think about the situation. Like Demont had a 0% chance of taking over the backfield with Jahmyr Gibbs there unless Gibbs got injured. Jordan Mason, maybe not 0% chance, but very unlikely that he was going to fully take over the backfield and be confidently started with Aaron Jones healthy. Same thing for Zach Charbonnet with Kenneth Walker. And so that's kind of the point that I want to drive home here is you don't want to spend potentially premium picks or even really mid-round picks on guys that are completely contingent plays. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't take late-round shots on high upside guys in ambiguous backfields, because I still think that's a very winning strategy. So a good example to kind of make a distinction between like ambiguous versus this kind of handcuff situation is Cam Scatabo from this year. He and Tyrone Tracy were in that camp battle to see who would start. But the outcome of that camp battle was truly an unknown. Like, is it possible that that could have ended up being a 50-50 split? Sure, that is possible. But was it also possible for one of them to just run away with it exactly like Cam Scatabo did? Yeah, that was maybe equally as likely. And so I think that bet is one that is easier to make and also happened to be cheaper this year than you would have had to pay for a Montgomery, Mason, or Charbonnet.
Absolutely. I would even say to a lesser degree, like a Bill Krosky Merritt, also another good situation where the very ambiguous backfield in Washington. Now, not a great situation team wise, but
Yeah.
he still had some good weeks in there as well. Like especially during playoffs. I think 22 points 1 week as well during
Yeah,
playoffs.
and to be fair, also with the Jaden Daniels injuries, we thought that situation was going to be a lot better than it ended up being.
Yeah.
So there was more upside to be had, without the hindsight.
Yeah. Very true.
But yeah, so just be careful about investing in pure handcuff running backs. Is kind of the point that I'm getting at there. But yeah, do you have another one here?
Yeah, I do, guys. I got to make a confession. I need us as a fantasy community to come together and realize that I don't think being quarterback proof is a thing. Like, I don't think it's a thing at all.
Yeah.
In the past, we've had a habit of calling wide receivers quarterback proof. And, that pretty much just states that no matter who's throwing them the ball, that receiver is going to eat. And I think we were proven horribly wrong this year by Nine himself, Mr. JJ McCarthy. Like honestly, I'm being serious because like literally he dropped Jetta's average points per game 7.5 points, like almost 9 points per game. So it's a good name for him, honestly, because he's working on it at this point. But when it comes to QB play with elite wide receivers, at this point now it feels like you have to have a quarterback who's at least around league average. That otherwise your offense is just going to kind of fall apart. And we got another example of that over in Cincinnati, another high-powered offense where a backup quarterback, Jake Browning, stepped in and could not get it done whatsoever. However, they bring in Joe Flacco, who somehow at age 40 is still league average at least, maybe even slightly above league average. He was balling out.
Honestly.
But that was the only thing they could really do to kind of get that to work out. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to tie it into what we're going into next because I feel like talent over situation / scheme fit has been pretty overblown in the last few years. Now, I think talent is always going to win out in the long haul because situations change every day in the NFL. They can change like that. But when it comes to buying into a bad situation early, that's just not something you should do if you can help it. So I'm not saying you should go out and trade Jettas if you have them in Dynasty just because JJ McCarthy's there. I don't think that's the answer. You hold on to him and you just hope that things change. But at the end of the day, if nothing changes, nothing changes.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I like that. I think that can be tough to predict at times. But the overall sentiment I completely agree with. You do have it kind of both ways, where like could JJ McCarthy have been a league average quarterback in a Kevin O'Connell system?
that's the thing. We had no idea going into this season at all. We had
Right,
zero clue.
right. And
So
and then like you look at like the Saints is the first one that comes to my mind because it's kind of transition us into my kind of intertwined lesson here that we need to focus way more on play callers. We thought that the Saints were doomed to be terrible. I didn't want to take anybody on the Saints. I didn't have a lot of exposure to Chris Olave in most places because I didn't think they had a quarterback. I didn't think that they had a supporting cast. But the play caller in this situation with Kellen Moore proved to kind of buoy the entire offense and make for a fantasy friendly environment. And I'll give credit where credit is due. I think Tyler Shuck and Spencer Rattler both proved us wrong to a certain extent that they are capable, at least mid tier NFL quarterbacks. Um, but to dive more into this focus on the play callers thing, I think it's something that the fantasy community in general has become more aware of and more focused on in recent years. But we need to really take it to the next level. Like this is really the key to unlocking a lot of fantasy secrets and getting ahead of fantasy trends, right? There are some that are really obvious. Obviously, Sean McVay and Kyle Shanahan are incredible play callers that produce great fantasy outcomes. We know that. There are some that are more obvious, even when they're going into new situations. We were pretty excited about Liam Cohen with that Jaguars roster. We were pretty excited about Ben Johnson with the Bears roster, even to a certain extent, Schottenheimer with the Cowboys. Those ones were slightly easier to predict. But then, like I mentioned with the Saints or Clint Kubiak in Seattle, Shane Steichen in Indianapolis, Josh McDaniels in New England, these are guys that have had either questionable pasts or perceived to have really bad rosters that we didn't think were going to perform as well as they did. And so having that insight and knowing what that scheme can do for players, I think would have allowed us to extract a lot of fantasy value in drafts that were otherwise left untapped. And then even on the opposite side of the spectrum, there are some new play callers that came into offenses that we expected to be great because of their rosters that kind of either tanked or just slightly underperformed where they were supposed to be. Guys like Kevin Patullo in Philly and John Morton in Detroit. Well timed and well deserved. But yeah, so I think we're probably going to have an entirely separate video dedicated to play callers, trying to dive into some of the coaching vacancies that have just been made heading into 2026, and some of the guys that could be replacements, so that you guys are aware of who these candidates are, what their schemes look like, what their past has been, to hopefully make us more prepared to make better decisions in 2026.
absolutely, because I think we as a community, we got to stop thinking that these players are just going to outperform their coaching situations.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, the situation is going to be what the situation is. I'm looking at y'all Eagles fans, and I'm looking at someone in the Discord who made a comment earlier this year because I want to see how that really ended at the end of the day.
Yeah. Yep. Yep. um, and then, if you're ready to transition, I do have one more lesson for
Absolutely.
2025, and that's who cares about wide receiver 1 versus wide receiver 2 labels. They don't matter. Okay, I promise you, stop looking at them. If you personally went into the 2025 draft season saying, I'm going to break ties with guys that are ranked similarly at wide receiver by whether they're their team's wide receiver 1 versus wide receiver 2, you would have drafted the likes of Marvin Harrison Jr. and Garrett Wilson over Devontae Adams. You would have drafted the likes of DK Metcalf and DJ Moore over George Pickens. And you would have drafted Calvin Ridley and Jerry Jeudy over Emeka Egbuka. These labels don't matter. I've been harping on it the entire video. Pay attention to context and team environment. That's what's most important. That's where the fantasy value is going to come from. All of those decisions that I just talked about would have been defensible based on public consensus back in September. And I understand obviously. We have hindsight now. It's easy to look back on those and say that they're bad decisions. But I think even at the time, if we had framed it differently, we could have come to a different conclusion. And I get that this also leaves out a ton of context, but for the sake of simplicity, if we just focus strictly on team environment and look at those same situations, would you have rather had the Jets wide receiver 1 or the Rams wide receiver 2?
If we're looking at real life,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm taking the Rams wide receiver too. I'm taking Devontae Adams.
Would you have rather had the Steelers wide receiver 1 or the Cowboys wide receiver 2?
Give me Pickens, bro. Come on.
Would you rather have the Browns wide receiver 1 or the Bucks wide receiver 2? I mean, come on, right?
Come
Like
on, yeah,
we could
yeah.
we could have come to these conclusions then, even without the hindsight that we have now, because we know that the Rams, Cowboys, Bucks are high-powered offenses that are going to produce big fantasy numbers. Give me the guys in those offenses, not the guys attached to I don't know what quarterback. I don't know this offensive coordinator. We just talked about the play callers can't do anything in the past. Like uh, focus on the offense, focus on the play caller, focus on the team environment. I think that is going to lead you to more fantasy success in 2026 than worrying about these labels that are irrelevant.
Absolutely agree.
So I think that will round it out. I appreciate you guys for sticking with us until the end. I hope you did learn something. Drop a little happy birthday to Will in the comments. I think that's really important. Shout out to Boy. Let him know you appreciate him. But also leave us a like on the video if you enjoyed. Hit that subscribe button and hit that notification bell if you want to stay up to date with all of our latest releases. Check out our link to the Discord if you want to join our conversation even further. And obviously leave comments to let us know what you think. But yeah, I think that'll do it. With that, we'll catch you in the next video. Peace.
Peace.
Bro, why is my shit doing this?